Hello, I'm Dee Dee. I'm here to read to you again from Safe People, Chapter 6, Part 2 today. Fear of confrontation. Andrea also had a pattern of choosing unsafe friends. She always had a close friend who did many good things for her, but who also consistently hurt her. Her current friend, Sandra, cared about Andrea and was intelligent and responsible, but she had a critical spirit. Andrea was off turmoil over some judgmental thing Sandra had said because Sandra acted as though she knew best how to run Andrea's spiritual life and well being. Andrea could have told Sandra to mind her own business, or she could have just accepted her type that she was and not let her affect her. But Andrea did not do any of those. She tried and tried to live up to Sandra's approval standards and fretted when she could not. Finally, she sought counseling. When I asked her what she had tried to do, she said, "Nothing really. I mean, I do the best I can to please her." "But have you ever told her how you feel when she's so critical?" I asked. "You must be kidding. I could never talk to Sandra that way." She almost seemed astonished that anyone would even consider confronting Sandra. "Why couldn't you just tell her that you like her a lot and still want to be friends, but that you experience her as critical and you would appreciate it if she would give specific advice or evaluation only when you ask for it?" I said. Andrea was not ready to do what I suggested, but we began to explore the issue of why something so simple was so difficult for her. The more we talked about it, the more she could see that confronting critical people had always been a problem for her and had gotten her into several very hurtful relationships in the past. When she would be with someone who was critical or hurtful, she was unable to talk with them about it and resolve the pattern. The problem with the inability to confront people is that non-confronters are the exact kind of people that hurtful people end up with. It is like a duck finding water. People who have good boundaries, who are able to confront others clearly, and who resolve problems in their relationships do not have the kinds of hurtful dynamics that Andrea experienced over and over. They are able to handle hurtful, unsafe people through biblical confrontation. But if someone is unable or afraid to do that, they are literally set up for a pattern of unsafe relationships, and they will rarely find a safe relationship. The inability to confront is license for unsafety. Being unable to confront someone is like having a farm with no fences or a body without skin. No matter how careful one is, he would always be getting poisoned or infected because of the lack of protection. Someone who is afraid to confront hurtful or abusive patterns in a relationship will find plenty of unsafe people available to take advantage of him. Romanticizing. Romanticizing is an idealized way of looking at someone or some situation in which the romanticizer only sees the good and omits a big part of the reality. She ignores the person's faults, or worse yet, she turns them into strengths by viewing them romantically. A romanticizer may even idealize the strength and aggression of an abuser, admiring how an abusive person can stand up to people and not seeing his hurtful actions. Chris romanticized in her relationships. She was dating a very irresponsible man. She saw his scatteredness as spontaneity, his lack of structure as creativity, his inability to hold down a consistent job as being too intelligent for all his bosses, his spendthrift habits as a lack of concern for temporal things like money and financial security. She was able to take all his glaring problems and fall in love with them, seeing them in a totally unrealistic, idealized way. People who are perpetually caught up in the romantic have set themselves up to meet many unsafe people. Charm is deceitful, says the Bible. Real relationships get past romantic feelings to true love and true intimacy. But romanticizers do not want reality because it has always disappointed them in the past. Romantics often cover up for a great deal of disappointment in their own personal history and idealize the future to make up for the sadness they've denied in their past. But we always return to what is denied in us, and the romantic finds the sadness that he or she has denied. But the problem is that they find it not in their own souls, where it could be worked out, but in new relationships. Desperately wanting to avoid painful reality, they create new painful realities with every new romanticized, unsafe person. Need to rescue. Jerry felt so strongly about Mindy that he could hardly describe it. I have never felt such a deep connection with anyone. I just can't let her go. Unable to leave a relationship that had been very hurtful to him over 5 years, Jerry pleaded with his friends for help, but they did not know what to say to him anymore. They had heard all the stories of how difficult Mandy was to be around, how impossible it was to please her no matter what he did, and how intense she was about insignificant things. Whenever they told him that he should say goodbye, he would have the same answer: the connection was too strong. He came to counseling to try to get out of the relationship because he could not do it by himself. We talked about the strong connection he felt. As it turned out, Jerry felt most connected when they would break up, and she would be really sad, or when other terrible things would befall her, and she would need him to comfort her or help her out. In fact, the best times they had were when she needed consoling, or help, or money, or some other crisis intervention by him. The truth was that they did not really have a mature connection at all. They had a rescuing connection. When she was in pain or in need of help, they were close. Other times, things were stormy. As we worked together, Jerry realized he was a rescuer. He picked people who couldn't meet any of his needs because they were so needy themselves. He would then step in and rescue them. Jerry had learned the rescuing pattern early in life from a needy mother who was unable to be satisfied. No matter what he or his father did, it was never enough. And with all of his mother's crises, he learned to feel closest when he was stepping in and taking care of her. It was his deepest connection with her. And now he had found the same sort of connection with someone else who needed rescuing. So he was unable to leave. People who need rescuing are not taking responsibility for their life, and people who do not take responsibility for their life are not safe, even though they may be very nice. Ultimately, they are not growing, and they are not fostering growth in the people who are rescuing them. Their life has spurts of sentimentality, but not a lot of mature love. Because a rescuer needs an unsafe person to rescue, rescuing always leads to unsafe people in one's life. Familiarity. I don't want to move out of hell because I know the names of all the streets, Tammy said in jest. She knew that she had some hurtful relational patterns, but to change them was going to be very hard work. Wouldn't it be easier to stay like I am? She would ask from time to time, and my reply would always be the same. Tammy, has it been easy through the years? And then she would get back to work. Tammy is one of those people who seemed addicted to hurtful relationships. No sooner would she get through with one than she would find another. She went from one self-centered man to another. Although they seemed different on the outside, they all had the same pattern of relating to her. She would be emotionally responsible for them and live to make them happy. They were all little boys inside who needed someone to make them feel like they were powerful men. And Tammy would do that. She would idealize them, worship them, and listen to their stories of how they were never wrong and everyone else had done them in. As we began to explore this pattern, we discovered that all these men were very much like her own father. Her father was a very narcissistic man who needed the whole family to think he was great, and Tammy played the role of cheerleader well. She never said no to him and lived to make him feel special. When he would exaggerate his accomplishments or minimize his faults, they would all keep quiet, and Tammy's mom would explain it away, making him sound all the better for it. So Tammy was doing what was familiar. She had simply learned that this pattern of relating from her father, modeled it with her mother, and continued it through 3 marriages. It was not something that she had to think about, it just happened. And that is the way that the familiar happens, without trying. God has designed us to learn patterns of relating in our family of origin. In his plan, we should be learning honesty, responsibility, and love, and then teaching them to our children. But when families model other ways of relating, children learn those as well. And Tammy did precisely that. She learned some sick ways of relating. They became familiar, and she repeated them. Like Tammy, we will always pick what is familiar until we develop a new familiar. Victim role. A victim is someone who has no power. Things are done to them, not by them. For instance, if you're run over by a drunk driver as you cross the street, you are a victim. A child who is abused is a powerless victim against an adult. Such people are powerless and do not have any choice. A victim role, however, is a pattern of relating and behaving that an adult does who actually is not powerless anymore, but experiences himself as such and acts out that powerlessness in his situations and relationships. He plays a role in being victimized and does not make the choices that are available to him to keep that from happening. Victims do not see themselves as actors or agents. They see themselves as acted upon. They use victim language. We ended up in bed instead of I chose to sleep with. I had to instead of I chose to. My taxes were late because the accountant didn't finish them in time, instead of I was so late getting my information to the accountant that my taxes were late. Victims do not take responsibility for their choices and behaviors. They see themselves as reacting to some power greater than them, be it traffic, the weather, a person, the economy, God, or luck. Victims are prime candidates for unsafe people. Unsafe people who take advantage of victims are called perpetrators, people who seek and destroy victims to gratify themselves. To the extent that someone will not take responsibility for their choices, perpetrators will make choices for them. The victim passively gives the reins of his life to someone else, and turning one's choices over to perpetrators is very unsafe. Victims need to learn that to not choose is to make a choice, and that they can take more control of their relationships than they believe by, for example, setting boundaries against abusive behavior and sticking to them. That's an important thing I just want to say real quick. Not choosing is still making a choice. Think about that. Okay. Guilt also causes people to get involved with unsafe people. People who carry guilt will look for someone to play the guilt inducer in their life. The guilt inducer often plays the martyr role, acting like his misery is the fault of the person who feels guilty. The guilty party, in turn, is hooked into taking responsibility for the other person's pain or anger or disappointments. He's easily manipulated and never feels free in the relationship. The hook, however, lies within the person who picks the guilt inducer. She will feel as if the guilt is put on her, and so and so makes me feel guilty. But this thinking is a disavowal of responsibility. For someone to make us feel guilty, we have to have some part of us that gets hooked into that dynamic and agrees with the accuser. That is why the power to be free is within us. When we begin to deal with our guilt, we can get free of the hook that guilt inducers use to control us. Again, I'm going to interject this whole thing of you should be ashamed of yourself. You should feel guilty about this. You cannot put that on other people. I mean, you can try to put that on other people, but unless the person feels inside of them that you are powerful enough to put that on them, they are not going to receive it. And I'm one of those people. So if you try to say shame on me, I will not receive your shame. I might receive some conviction from God, but I will not receive shame from human beings. So you're wasting your breath. Okay. And neither should you, unless you did something awful, in which case you should make things right, apologize, turn your ways around, that kind of thing. But to say you should feel ashamed of yourself or you should be ashamed of yourself, putting shame on people, that's just plain wrong and evil. All right. People who feel loved by others and understand their freedom and lack of condemnation in Christ, Romans 8:1, evaluate messages from others in terms of love and whether or not they are really at fault. If they are at fault, then they act appropriately. If they are not, then they have personal boundaries required to not take the guilt hook and to let the other party bear responsibility for their own feelings and choices. Proverbs 19:19. I'm trying to see what this bug is that's crawling around here. Okay. If someone's unsafe relationships center around the dynamic of guilt, she needs to find the source of the guilt within her own personality makeup and work on changing that critical voice inside. Then the inducers will have no foothold with which to manipulate her. Perfectionism. Tom was a perfectionist. He would not really think of himself as such, as he was not particularly compulsive about details and nitpicky the way that a lot of perfectionists are. But he was perfectionistic in that he wanted others to always think well of him. If they did not see him as ideal in whatever context he was in, he was subject to anxiety and would begin to perform to meet the ideal expectations of the one he was with. Tom's perfectionism propelled him toward people who demanded perfection in others. In this way, he could find an external match for the perfectionistic voice in his own head. He usually struggled with this dynamic in his work life, trying to please bosses that could never be pleased. The dynamic would sometimes interfere in his value system as well, as he would make compromises to portray the ideal image he wanted to portray. For example, he would often overspend in order to impress people. Finally, Tom's perfectionism wore him down. He joined a group that was able to show him that the hurtful relationships in which he got involved resulted from his choosing people who put the perfectionistic pressure on him that he put on himself. As he was able to allow good people to love and accept him as he really was, then the power of those that would not accept him disappeared. He no longer was drawn to people who made perfectionistic demands on him, and he stopped trying to live up to the perfectionistic demands of his wife, which forced her to deal with her own disappointments instead of making him responsible for all the problems in their marriage. As he changed, so did she, breaking free of the unsafe role she had played in his life. Okay, repetition. We only got a little bit more, and then we are done with this chapter, and then I'll tell you what's coming up because it's good. Repetition. We spoke earlier in this chapter about Jessie, a woman who had picked 9 unsafe husbands. She had more than one reason for doing that, but one of them is called repetition. She was caught in a destructive relational pattern that she had learned early in life and had repeated over and over again. Although the pattern was not satisfying or growth producing, Jessie repeated her behavior without learning anything from her mistakes. She did not change, and her next relationship was no closer to health than the last one. Health, that is, not health. Health with a TH. When we are very young, patterns of relating are hardwired into our brains as part of our character. We have certain dynamics and patterns that we repeat until we change them. For Jessie, the pattern was 1. Feel attracted and excited by an emotionally unavailable man. 2. Experience his stimulating come-and-go game as being in love. 3. Experience his hurtful behavior as creating more longing in her. 4. Begin to try to win him over by compliant behavior. 5. He gets more self-centered the more compliant she gets. 6. Gets so painful she can no longer stand it. 7. Tries to break up. 8. Is unable to stand the separation, so she returns to the relationship. And 9. Repeats the cycle. As Jessie began to understand her pattern, she could see that it was the same pattern she'd learned with her mother. Her mother had been volatile and difficult to connect with and often left her needing more. Jessie would try to placate her mom with good behavior, but it was never enough. Anger in another person was something she tried to perform her way through instead of confront and deal with. So the pattern was set. This was how her mind was programmed to deal with relationships. There was no wiring for anything else. So she repeated the pattern over and over the way that a rat runs down a familiar maze. Jessie had to gain insight into the pattern, deal with her unresolved feelings toward her mother, learn how to connect with satisfying people, and then make some tough choices and learn new behaviors. In that way, her repetition ceased, and she was able to find new kinds of relationships. This is an appropriate place to correct a common misunderstanding about relationships. Often it is said that if you have trouble with a man in a friendship or relationship, you are repeating patterns learned with your father. If you have trouble with a woman, you are dealing with your mother. This is not true. Patterns of relating are patterns of relating. And although there are specific reactions we have to specific same-sex or opposite-sex interactions, our problematic relational patterns can certainly cross gender lines. For example, an unfinished pattern with a mother can affect how we relate to men friends who have her same personality. What is important is the dynamic and the resulting behavior and feeling patterns that are repeated. Denial of pain and perceptions. Hebrews 5:14 says, "But solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil." The root word for practice also can mean habit and comes from the word meaning echo. In other words, we should learn from what we experience over and over. But people whose senses have been dulled do not learn from experience. They may have had abusive parents who claimed that their abuse was actually loving, or perfectionistic parents who said, "I only want the best for you." Therefore, they have learned not to trust their pain, their perceptions, their feelings, and all the other ways that God gave us to discern reality. People whose senses have been dulled often get stuck in destructive relationship patterns. They have not learned to pay attention to, or they actively deny their God-given gut feelings that someone is hurting them. They cannot discern good from evil, and so over and over again, they find themselves entangled in evil, destructive relationships. Our feelings, intuition, and perceptions are important. It is very important for us to get in touch with our feelings instead of just believing what someone else tells us, especially when that person may be unsafe. Instead, we should test and develop our perceptions with safe people. Scripture, our support group, our therapist, with their help, we should discern the fruits of our relationships. Then we will mature, learning from our experiences instead of repeating them ad infinitum. As 1 Thessalonians 5:21 and 22 advises, test everything. Hold on to the good. Avoid every kind of evil. A necessary part of sanctification. There are many reasons why we pick unsafe people, and it's good for us to look at those reasons, for they are all essential issues of the spiritual life the Bible commands us to look at anyway. Look at the list again. Inability to judge character, isolation, false hope, unfaced badness, merger wishes, fear of confrontation, romanticizing, rescuing, familiarity, victim roles, guilt, perfectionism, repetition, and denial. These are all issues that the Bible deals with very directly and tells us to face as part of our sanctification process. It is for this reason that finding safe people is not just a luxury, it's a necessary part of growing spiritually mature. God wants us to have good relationships and to be people who are able to fight evil. If you have a pattern of bad relationships, it may not be the other person's fault, but a sign of your own spiritual immaturity. Look at the list of issues in this chapter and see what applies to you. Recognize your patterns, then change them, and you will begin to grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord. And as you change, the people around you will adapt and change, and you will break the patterns of behavior that have kept you trapped in unsafe relationships. As you change your behavior, however, watch out for the false solutions, remedies we often try in our efforts to deal with unsafe relationships. Those false solutions are the subject of the next chapter. So the next chapter will deal with false solutions, which is the things that we try in our efforts to stay in those unsafe relationships. So I hope you enjoyed that. This has been the reading from Safe People by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend, copyright 1995. See you next time when we talk about the false solutions, I believe. False solutions, yes. See you there. Thanks for watching. God bless and be safe.